Time to read some more of A Day of Rest by Edna Creekmore Carman, part of chapter 13 today. And this is the picture that goes with the beginning of the chapter. Chapter 13. Would Susan go home? Bert pondered the question over and over as the wagon bumped along the Rocky Mountain Road. Susan had never been in the woods by herself before. She had never even gone as far as the barn or the chicken house by herself. Bert was worried about his sister. Lying on his stomach with his hands tied behind his back and his feet tied to the wagon stave, Bert still did not worry about himself. He had been in far worse circumstances and had come out unscathed. He wouldn't count that time he got caught beneath the floor of the house. It had been uncomfortable, but he had not been scared. He knew his dad would get him out when he got home. He had been in danger that time he was down visiting Uncle Charles and went swimming in Willow Creek with Jazz. Just showing off, he had dived into the creek with his clothes on. As he came up for air, his overall straps had caught on the branches of a tree that had fallen into the creek. But everything happened so fast, he didn't have time to get scared. Before he had time to start swallowing water, Al, who was working right there in the field, had heard Jazz yelling and came over to see what was the matter. Immediately, Al dove in and helped Jazz get Bert loose. That time he had been in real danger of drowning, but didn't have a chance to realize it before Al had him loose. But now he was tied up like a pig going to market, while the wagon bumped and jerked, bumped and jerked, bumped and jerked. The bottles clinked together while the cut wood thudded on the wooden bed. Worst of all, he had plenty of time to realize what was going on, and he was getting worried because he didn't know how long he could stand the continual bumps and bruises. If Jim had stayed hidden in the mine, there would have been no need to worry about Susan. He would have been free to take Susan home. The wagon creaked, the bottles clinked, the wood thudded at each bump in the road surface. The men rode in silence. However, silent as the men were, Bert knew they were there, just as much as he knew Jim was in the wagon beside him. With each bump and jerk of the wagon, Jim slid forward and then backward. He rolled first to one side and then back to the other. Lying on the rough wagon bed, Jim felt each rock, each rut, each stick in the road, magnified by the wheels of the wagon. At first, he was able to hold himself together and minimize the bumping, the sliding, and the rolling. But in the unaccustomed position, his muscles soon tired, and unable to control his response, he bumped and rolled and slid with each jar. Bruises soon formed on his shoulder and hip and intensified the pain. Jim could take the pain of a bruise. He knew that. It wasn't as if he hadn't been bruised before. Golly, yes, and afraid too. There was that time with the cart. The cart had been Cal's idea. He had found the 4 rusty wheels in the shed at the barn one day. He then looked around until he found the old wooden boxes in the corn loft over the chicken house. With Jim helping, Cal had made the cart out of the boxes and the wheels. Cal was pushing the cart with Jim in it around the barn lot when Jake and Bruce Campbell had come visiting. Bruce said that if they made some rails out of pine logs to put the cart on, the cart would push much easier. It was then that Jake said that if they had the rails going down the side of the mountain, they wouldn't have to push the cart at all. If they elevated the rails on a scaffolding with an incline, he bet they would really get a good ride. They left the cart in the barn lot and went down past the cornfield back of the Weaver house and began cutting the long, slender pine poles to make the rails. It took 3 Saturdays with the 4 of them working, but they finally did finish the scaffolding and got the rails in position. They filled the cart with rocks and let it go at the top of the incline. The first ride with the rocks in the cart was perfect. The cart went straight down the side of the hill, just as smooth as you please. Then Cal and Jim and Jake got in the cart. They hadn't figured out how to brake the cart at the top, so Bruce had to hold it until they were in. When Bruce let go, the cart started. It had been a fine ride until the left front wheel hit that bump of rosin. The cart had then risen up on the right wheels and careened along. They had all hollered in fun as their stomachs had risen into their throats. But then the cart hadn't come down on the rails correctly. The left side drug along for a while on the axle while the right wheels spun on. Then the left wheels, which were hanging over the rail, hit a knot the boys hadn't bothered to cut off the side of the pole, and the right side of the cart had risen in the air. The 3 boys had shifted their weight until the right side was back on the rail. The left side of the cart was lifted into the air and then came back down on the rail just as it should be. And for a few minutes it seemed that everything was okay. The cart was level and they were coasting along. They were about halfway down the hill by then. The trees were whizzing by faster and faster. The trees had become just a blur when Jim realized that they were whizzing along on just the right wheels, and slowly the cart was tipping farther and farther to the right. The boys shifted their weight to the left, but it was too late. The cart was falling, and Jim was really scared. But before Jim could stop laughing, they had landed in some sumac bushes that grew under the tracks. There had been no broken bones, but the boys were bruised, more from being slammed together than from the fall. So they all laughed as they dragged the cart back up the mountain and said what great fun it had been and how they were going to smooth out the rails the next Saturday. They had worked on the rails the next Saturday, but somehow they never got around to actually trying the cart again. Yeah, it had been a bad scare, but it had been over so fast, and he had had company, so it had not seemed bad. He had company now, but Bert was tied up just the same way he was, and it looked as if they were going to be tied up for a long time, and neither one could help the other. Even that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that his mother was going to be worried. She wouldn't worry at first, not even because he wasn't there doing the milking like he was supposed to. But later she would worry, and there was nothing he could do about it. Would Bert's dad worry? Was Bert concerned about that? Bert wasn't concerned about his dad worrying. His dad would start looking for him if Susan got home. But would Susan get home? Could she follow the stream as she should? Would she remember to turn right after the pond? Did she even know which was right and which was left? A sudden slowing of the wagon caused both Jim and Bert to stop worrying about what might happen and to wonder what was happening right then. Why were the men stopping? Had they gotten where they were going? Was there someone near that they could call to? Both of the boys listened for a voice, but there wasn't a sound. Even the drivers were quiet. Then the wagon shook as one of the men stepped down. There was a clink of a bottle as one was removed from the back of the wagon. Still no one spoke. The man climbed back into the wagon, and then the wagon rumbled on. Soon the wagon stopped again, and again. Once Jim heard a voice, but wasn't sure whether it was someone new or whether it was one of the men talking to the other one. Should he try to attract attention? Jim couldn't make up his mind what to do until the wagon began to move again. It was too late. The rattling of the wagon would cover any sound he made with the gag in his mouth. Jim gave up. he tried not to think about where he was going or what was going on. Again the wagon stopped. Bert had felt Jim tense when the wagon stopped before. This time Jim just lay there without moving until he heard the woman's voice. Jim stiffened as Bert heard the woman say quite plainly that she would take some of the kindling as well as some of the wood. Bert recognized the voice. It was Mrs. Wilson, one of Dad's cousins. Mrs. Wilson lived in Green Crossing. If that was Mrs. Wilson's voice wanting the wood, then they must be at Green Crossing. But why were they at Green Crossing? The two men lived down by Al on Lower Willow Creek. And that's where we're going to stop for today.